Hey y'all, tonight I'm excited to speak with Dr. David Kyle Johnson about insights into the afterlife. So sit back, buckle up, and let's get to the sunny spot on Skeptic Haven.
Jefferson laid great stress on it. It wasn't enough, he said, to enshrine some rights in a Constitution or a Bill of Rights. The people had to be educated, and they had to practice their skepticism and their education. Otherwise, we don't run the government. The government runs us.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am so excited to introduce to you Dr. David Kyle Johnson, who I will just call Kyle today. He is Associate Professor of Philosophy at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He earned a master's degree and doctorate in philosophy from the University of Oklahoma. He has also won the coveted Kenneth Merrill Graduate Teaching Award. Did I say that right?
Yep, that's a long time ago, but yes, I did.
In 2011, the American Philosophical Association's Committee on Public Philosophy gave him an award for his ability to make philosophy accessible to the general public. I loved that sentence on your page, so I had to make sure that I shared that. I think it's always great when anyone can make philosophy accessible to the general public, because sometimes people kind of start talking way up here when it gets to philosophy. So
Yes,
congratulations on that.
Thanks. Yeah, and I've done a lot since then. That was 2011. I've done a lot to bring philosophy to the public light since then. That includes 3 courses with the great courses. I've done a bunch of pop culture and philosophy books, including contributing and editing those. I just got done editing the Pelgrave Handbook of Pop Culture as Philosophy, which is also geared at a broader audience. That was 95 chapters,
Wow.
all at about 8,000 to 10,000 words long. That was a lot of editing. But that's one of the main things I try to do, is try to bring philosophy to the public in a way that is understandable. And so that's why I do podcasts when people ask me to come on podcasts. So that's a good way to do it.
Awesome. Well, we're glad that you have taken the time to be with us. We really do appreciate that. And I want to tell everyone who is in our live chat that we appreciate you coming and spending your time with us as well. So, Kyle, let's jump right in. The first thing I want to talk about is what I've been reading up on the soul. So,
Okay.
can you tell me, is there such a thing as a soul?
Well, short answer, no. But it does depend on what you mean by soul, which certainly has many different meanings. Everything from literally, like, soul can mean emotion, right? Like soul music, or somebody has soul or whatever, and they just mean that they're emotional, or that they have a certain je ne sais quoi or whatever, right? But that's not what we're talking about.
Right.
Normally, when people talk about a soul, what they mean is a soul is supposed to be an immaterial entity. So immaterial just means not material, right? It's made of something, but it's not matter, right? Which is not really a helpful description, but that's usually how people talk about this.
Right.
Immaterial entity, basically like a container. It is what contains your mentality. So your soul is where perceptions are had, emotions are felt, decisions are made, visual experiences are had, auditory experiences are had. Decisions are made, like, so what free will usually is linked to the soul, where, like, so there's this immaterial entity that's not subject to physical causation, and you can make a decision, consider things, and you can reason something else is supposed to happen in the soul. And all of that can happen. And then whenever a decision is made, it reaches down from the non-physical realm and causes your body to move in a certain kind of way. But it's also like when you feel emotions, that's where that happens, it's what houses your personality. Your personality is in your soul. And so it's supposed to be this immaterial container, as it were, that houses your mentality. And classically, the soul is supposed to be something that is separable from the body, so that when you die, that container can take itself along with all of your mentality, your consciousness, your experiences, your memories, everything else, right? And float away from your body when you die and continue to exist. That's the idea. Not everybody conceives a soul that way. Like Aquinas, the Catholic philosopher Aquinas, who studied Aristotle, thought the soul was more like whatever animates living objects. So like whatever it is that makes living objects living rather than not living. That's what the soul. It's like literally like anime. Like it's an animating force. And that is, I mean, basically like what animates you is your particular physical structure. And so because you have this structure, that's why you're animated. That's a very different kind of concept. Arguably, Aquinas also thought that this structure was immaterial in a certain kind of way. That's a whole other thing, but that's not usually how people think of soul. Like Aquinas didn't think that your soul was you, right? But normally when people talk about souls, they think of it as like your soul is you. It's what contains your mentality. It is you. That's how you continue to exist after you die, is that your soul separates and floats away from your body. It's really difficult to say where it started, like who first came up with the idea of soul. It likely probably originated in a bunch of different places and they influenced each other. One of the earliest kind of, I won't say defenses, maybe not the right word or whatever, but articulations of this idea comes from Plato. And the reason it's conceived of as it was is because, and this is also one of the reasons to think that like souls aren't real, is because soul for Plato was intimately related with this whole philosophy he had about the realm of forms. So for Plato, he had this idea of like, why do we recognize different objects as the same kind of object? So like I always use chairs. You think about all the different kinds of chairs that you could recognize, from desks in a room to like a rolling chair to 4 legs to 6 legs to those weird ones that don't have any legs and you sit in a weird way and they don't have a back. Like those are all different. Why do we recognize them all as chairs? Plato thought that there was this immaterial realm of what he called forms with a capital F. And it's literally like it's a place that's more real than the material world, and it possesses an immaterial perfect example of everything there is on earth. Forms, chairs and tables, and then even more abstract things like justice and fairness. There's a form for all of those. The form of goodness was like the ultimate form. Like, so for anything that we could recognize on earth, there was this immaterial form for it. And he literally thought that when you learn something that you didn't know before, what's happening is that your soul is one of these objects. It's this immaterial thing like a form. It's because they're all immaterial, right? Your soul existed with the forms before you were born. When you were born, your soul gets trapped in your body and forgets a bunch of stuff. And then when you learn something new, it's your soul remembering what it used to know in the realm of forms, but has since forgotten, but now it remembers. So it's like it's tied in with this whole idea of the forms being real, and that learning is actually just recollection. It's recalling what your soul once knew in the realm of forms. And then he thought that when you die, your soul he can't believe in reincarnation, but eventually your soul would go back into the realm of forms, right? And so since like that's like the whole concept of soul is tied to all of that, right? And for some strange reason, nobody thinks forms exist anymore. Nobody thinks that learning is recollection, and yet we still believe in souls, right? And if it's all kind of together as one package, why would you pull out one part of that? That one part of it really doesn't really make any sense without all the other parts of it, right? And so, but despite all of that, the reason that scientists and philosophers, and if you're interested in the details on this, I have a nice article that's just called "Do Souls Exist?" It was published with Think a few years ago, more than a decade ago now, I guess. But the reason that, right, so I go into more detail on this in that paper, but the reason that scientists and philosophers generally do not believe that souls exist is, and in philosophy, if you ever see the term substance dualism, that's basically
right.
It's this idea that there's two substances, material and immaterial substance, is for two reasons. There's basically philosophic and scientific reasons for thinking that souls don't exist. One, the arguments for the soul do not work very well. And the burden of proof is always on the believer. So if you don't have good reasons to believe that something exists, then the default position is that it doesn't exist. The arguments for the soul are not very good. The most famous are Descartes. Descartes says things like,
Mhm.
well, I can imagine that I can't doubt that my mind exists, but I can doubt that my body exists. So they must be separable entities. That's a terrible argument. The fact that you can conceive of one existing but not the other doesn't mean that they're really not. That doesn't mean that they're really separate objects. The example I always give is like Lois Lane can, it's like she cannot doubt that Superman is a hero, but she definitely can doubt that Clark Kent is a hero. Therefore, Clark Kent and Superman are different people. Obviously, that doesn't follow. Conceivability is not the kind of thing that can be used to delineate objects in this way. And so the arguments fail. But a really good one to understand why it fails. Is there a perfect form of the forms? Yes. I saw that at the bottom. Plato thought the form of the good was like the form of forms. So it was like, I don't know how to explain all of that or whatever, but that's basically was his idea, was the form of forms was the form of the good. And then all the other forms were like a replication of that form. And then all those, it's complicated and weird. So there's a nice transition in between the philosophic and the scientific reasons. One of the arguments that Descartes gave was that, well, the body and the soul must be separate things because you can't divide the mind, but because, the soul is what's supposed to house the mind. You can't divide the mind, but you can divide the body. So one's divisible, the other one's not, so they must be separate objects. Well, it turns out that you can divide the mind, right? Mm-hmm. We know now about split brain patients, right? Where if you cut the corpus callosum, you end up having two different streams of consciousness, right? And how do you split the mind? By splitting the brain. That's how you split it, right? And so what that kind of leads us to, and this actually came before split brain patients too, was we realized that mentality, all the things that we used to think the soul did, right? Houses memory. It's what's responsible for memory and your personality and your experiences and your emotions and your reasoning and all of those things we now know are produced by the brain, right? There was actually, I forget his name, but there was a Greek philosopher way back when who started to suspect that this was the case. And we've known kind of it's kind of been obvious that there's a relationship between these two things for a while. Because if you hit somebody on the head hard enough, they lose their mind, right? They go unconscious, right? So we've known that there's been a relationship, but neuroscience has really, really clearly shown this relationship where we realize that reasoning happens in the prefrontal cortex, right? And emotions happen in the limbic system, and your senses are here in the Penfield map, and your visual experiences start here in the back of the visual center, and then they're shunted along two pathways. And taste is here, and hearing is there, and da-da-da-da-da. Like we know that the mind is produced by the brain, right? How the brain produces the mind is a slightly different question. That's called the hard problem of consciousness, identified by a philosopher named David Chalmers. I think there is a certain kind of solution to that. That's a whole other topic. It's one very similar to one that he suggested. And if you want to know about that in about a year, I'm going to be coming out with a revised version of my Exploring Metaphysics course with the Great Courses, and I'm going to go into detail on that. But
awesome.
The fact that we don't have an agreed solution to the hard problem of consciousness of how the brain produces the mind does not mean that we do not know that the brain produces the mind, right? In the same way that, in a certain kind of way, we really don't understand how electrons produce, and magnets produce magnetic fields, right? We know that it has to do with the alignment of electrons and their properties and that kind of stuff. But how is it that a magnetic field is produced? Well, we know it is, right? How is that produced? Well, it just kind of is. We know that it is. And so we have a law that says that it is, but the actual hard problem of, well, how does that get produced? We don't have a full explanation of, other than we just have a law that says that such a thing happens. So in a similar way, we know the brain produces the mind, and that you can't have and specifically we know that when particular parts of your brain are injured and no longer functioning, you lose particular mental functions. And so as a result, the way I always put it to my students is we used to think that I always put the soul up here. Soul was here and it contained all of these different things, right? All these different parts of our mentality. And then Phineas Gage happened. And Phineas Gage was this famous case of a guy that was a railroad worker. He was a really nice guy. Tamping iron went through the bottom of his, right, out the top of his skull, destroyed part of his forebrain. His personality completely changed. And so what we realized is, oh, we thought personality was up here. It's actually here, right? And then we discovered others. Oh, we thought language is up here. And it's in Brucker and Wernicke's area over here, right? Oh, we thought reasoning was here, it's here. And everything that we thought was up here in the soul, we get different locations for it being in the brain. And so the idea that once your brain stops functioning, your mentality can continue is completely debunked essentially at that point, right? Because we know that you can't have mental activity, that mental activity is dependent upon brain activity. So once brain activity ceases, there's no more mental activity, right? It's not contained in a separate entity that can separate. It's produced by your brain, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, did that answer your question? I think I went on a rant there, but you asked me what the soul was. Did that?
No.
And oh, yes,
Yeah. No, you did.
Yes. And there's your answer, right?
No, you did great, because and you actually answered a lot of the questions I was going to ask, such as what is the difference between a soul and the brain, and you kind of answered that pretty well. So when we think about the soul, and because there's still a lot of people, you talked about neuroscience has pretty much debunked the whole theory of the soul, but there's still a lot of people who believe in the soul.
Of course, yeah.
So why do you think that is?
Oh, well, tradition, most definitely, right? Like, I mean, there's a number of different things, right? Like, so a lot of people believe in the soul because that's what they were taught as a kid, and they were taught that as a kid because that's what their religion teaches, right? And they don't bother to critically examine that idea at all, right? They want to because they think that is the only way that an afterlife is possible. It's not, by the way, and we can talk about that. But they want to believe in an afterlife, and they think to believe in an afterlife, they have to believe in the soul. So just default, they're going to believe in a soul because they think they have to have that comfort of thinking that they will continue on after their death. And then so they're taught that. Stories about near-death experiences might play a role, although I think usually that's more reverse reasoning. It's people who already believe in the soul that try to use near-death experiences as a way to bolster that belief that they already have. I don't think there's probably a lot of people who didn't believe in the soul and then they hear about a near-death experience. It's like, oh, I guess I'll change my mind. I guess I believe now. That could happen, but that might be a reason that some people believe. But I think that's more like a kind of an ad hoc afterwards kind of post hoc rationalization for, and we can talk about why near-death experiences are not good evidence for the soul. But I mean, it's definitely the case that religion plays a large role in it. I think in one of my papers that I gave you, I have a statistic where like 81% of Christians think that near-death experiences are a result of the soul floating away from the body. So belief in the soul is really, really common in Christianity. What's ironic about that is that although it is widely perceived to be like it is widely perceived to be that this is the Christian doctrine, that when you die, your soul detaches from your body and floats up to heaven, and that's where it goes, and that's the afterlife, is your soul living on in heaven, right? And that really has never been the Christian view, not in its entirety anyway. So in the early days of Christianity, it was definitely not like the view. There was multiple views in early Christianity. But like if you look at the Gospels and you look at Scripture, when you talk about afterlife, they talk way more about resurrection. One of my favorite passages to demonstrate this is 1 Corinthians 15, where the Apostle Paul basically says, like, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but basically says, like, I've heard some of you don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. Well, that's too bad, because if there's no resurrection, there's no afterlife. Like, if there's no resurrection, then when we die, we're dying. We might as well eat, drink, and be merry, because that's it, right? Like, the only way there's an afterlife is if there's a resurrection. And you don't believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. No, it has to be that Jesus was raised. If Jesus wasn't raised, then we won't be raised. And if we won't be raised, there's no afterlife. Jesus was like this Jesus' resurrection was like this proof of concept that death did not have to be the end, that God could raise you back from the dead, right? And so because Jesus was raised, we can now believe that we will be raised, and that means that we can believe in the afterlife. So it's all wrapped up in, like, Paul's not thinking that your soul floats away or anything like that. Yeah, if there's going to be an afterlife, it's an embodied afterlife, and it's facilitated by a resurrection. At best, he says that the physical body that you have will be transformed into a spiritual body, so into some kind of other kind of body. But it's not, you got a soul and that soul is immortal, so when you die, it floats away. Paul's not talking that way at all, right? And that is like the talk in Christianity, at least for the first 400 years. There's debate about what's happening with the soul, but it's always tied to some kind of resurrection. Usually the debate that happens in early Christianity is about, if we do have a soul, what's it doing between the time you die and when you're reunited, when it's reunited with the body? There's got to be some kind of resurrection that is like that is key in the Christian doctrine about the afterlife, is eventually there'll be a resurrection of the dead. Whether that involves a soul reuniting with the body or just you come back into existence when your body is raised, that's where the debate is. But it's never just, oh, your soul floats up to heaven and that's the end of the story. There's always some kind of resurrection that comes with it. And then later, a lot of later Christian thinkers end up rejecting this idea. Like John Calvin thought that the soul idea was silly, right? That it was like belonged on the dung heap or something like that. The guy who, I think he was the guy that first translated the Bible. Let me look up his name really quick. I have it right here. I thought I did anyway. Right. What was his name? William Tyndale, who first translated the Bible into English. But who was unfortunately later strangled and then burned at the stake. He thought that like the soul was not a thing, right? Like some of the other ones I have here. Biblical scholar N.T. Wright rejected the notion, as does Nicky Gimbel, who's a famous Anglican priest and vicar and author. Maybe the most important theologian of all time, Karl Barth, rejected the idea. The early Christian apologist Justin Martyr told his friend Typhro, quote, "If you have fallen in with some who are Christians, but who say their souls when they die are taken into heaven, do not imagine they are Christians," right? Like, it is not this kind of universal, oh yeah, Christians have always believed this kind of idea. There has been debate for a long time. And modern scholars that reject the idea include Nancy Murphy, Brian McLaren, Leron Schultz, Joel Greene, Stanley Greens, who I believe is evangelical theologian. Like, there's a lot of people.
That's surprising.
Who reject this idea, and largely because they recognize that it has been debunked, right? Like the neuroscientific evidence and the philosophical problems with it. Like another one I call it, called the problem of downwards causation, where how can an immaterial entity causally affect a material entity? There's no explanation for how that can happen. They recognize the philosophical and scientific problems with it. And so they recognize it like, well, if we think that Christianity demands that the soul exists, so we tie our horse, right? We tie our cart to this horse and say Christianity demands that the soul is real. Well, if it demands that that is the case, and so Christianity is false if souls don't exist, then all of those arguments against the soul become arguments directly ipso facto as arguments against Christianity.
Right.
And so they're like, well, we don't want that to happen, right? So we're going to kind of unhitch our cart from this horse, right? And point out that, well, Christianity does not have to believe in the soul. So all these arguments against the soul's existence, well, they're not directly arguments against Christianity. Christianity can survive without it. It did okay for the first 400 years without it being a direct, canonical doctrine. A lot of Christians have rejected it over time. So Christianity would just be better to kind of leave it aside, right? So it's ironic, given that a lot of people believe in the soul for religious reasons, in particularly like Christian reasons, given the fact that Christianity is not universally accepted it over the last 2,000 years. Again, it's a popular view, but it's not a universal view.
When did it really start becoming so popular then?
Well, it's debatable. Certainly in the first 400 years, there's discussions again about it. There's some people who believe it, some people don't. Even in Judaism, there's kind of like, at first Jews don't believe in the afterlife. Because they think that God's going to, they think that God's going to fulfill their promise by restoring Israel. When it becomes clear that's not going to be the case, they start thinking, well, maybe God's going to keep his promise by an afterlife. But even then, it's through resurrection. if you remember in the Bible, the difference between the Pharisees and the Sadducees is one believes in resurrection, the other one doesn't. I forget
Right.
which one is which. And then it's not until later till you maybe get some Greek influence and you have that. Although they used to believe in Sheol and the shadows of the dead, but that was not a conscious afterlife. Simplistically, I'll say it this way. This is not like, it definitely predates Augustine. But the easiest way to kind of conceptualize what's going on with Christianity is for the first 400 years, there's lots of resurrection talk. Maybe there's a soul with that, maybe not. People are kind of debating that back and forth. But then Augustine comes along. Augustine studies Plato. Plato, big on the soul, right?
Right.
So Augustine incorporates all that Platonism, all that soul talk, and even forms talk and that kind of stuff into his theology. And then Augustine becomes a very influential theologian, and his thoughts become very, very influential in the early Catholic Church. And so it kind of weeds that soul talk weeds its way into Catholicism after Augustine, which is around 400. And so that's kind of when it starts. But then like Aquinas later challenges that. And then you got, John Calvin challenged that. And a bunch of people challenged that afterwards as well. So it's a very, very simplistic kind of understanding. It's way more complicated than that, but that's a basic kind of way to think about it. Yeah.
Okay, so that kind of goes right into near-death experiences then, because that pretty much is the view that your soul rises from your body after you die or as you're dying, because it's a near-death experience, so you actually still remain alive.
Right.
So let's talk. For those who, I think that most people who are watching this do, but just, for the sake of argument, can you tell us what near-death experiences, what we're talking about with this? What are they?
Yeah, sure. And near-death experiences are so interesting because they're like, there's a mix of good science and then really bad science in here, right? So near-death experiences, as described, it's an experience that people have when they're near death, right? They are real in that there are experiences that people report, like when people get close to death and they're brought back, right? Their heart stops, their brain starts, and then they're brought back with paddles or whatever to make their heart stop beating or whatever is necessary to bring them back. There are documented, medically verified reports of experiences that people have when that happens to them. And interestingly, the experiences are all very similar. They follow a certain kind of pattern, as it were. Let me get a book.
Okay. As you're doing that, the question that I have, are they similar across religions even?
Yes. So I actually was going to mention this at the end, but I will mention it now. So the fact that they are so similar is evidence itself that no religion would want, right? Because here we go. Because if near-death experiences are actually caused, so again, they do occur. The question is, what causes them? Is it the soul floating away from the body and returning, or is it something else? It's something else. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if it was the soul floating away from the body and then returning, right? Then the near-death experiences of certain kinds of people should be very different from the near-death experiences of other kinds of people, right? Some people, near-death experiences should be very blissful and wonderful, right? In certain religions. And all the other religions would have terrible, horrible near-death experiences, right? Because some would be going to heaven and some would be going to hell. No, right? Clinically, these things have been studied, right? Across religions, across genders, across races, across everything, near-death experiences are basically the same for everybody, right? They follow a certain, there's basically 5 stages in a near-death experience. They start, by the way, I'm pulling this from Ted Schick's book, How to Think About Weird Things, 9th edition. I'm on page 273 if you want to tune in. 5 stages, basically. A peace and a sense of well-being happens first. You have this feeling of separation from the body. It feels like you're floating out of your body. And then you enter the darkness and you see a light. There's kind of like this tunnel light experience that happens with it, right? And then you enter the world of light, right? Sometimes they also come with like a rewind where you think about, things that happened in your life and that kind of stuff, right? And it turns out that there's like this direct, when you study, when people have these experiences, they ask them what did you experience, da, 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 da. and they cataloged what people, and it turns out that the longer you're in one, the deeper you go. So in other words, they happen in a certain kind of order. Let's see. Earlier stages reported more frequently than the latter. 60% of the subjects who had some kind of near-death experience reached the first stage. 37 reached the second, 23 reached the third, 16% reached the fourth, and only 10% reached the fifth. So it's like the longer you're under, the kind of deeper you go into it, which means that things are happening in a certain kind of order, right?
Okay.
And so, again, if it was your soul floating away from heaven, there wouldn't be an order. It would be, if you're Christian, wee, and if you're not, burn, right? Like, I mean, that's what would happen. Or depending on what religion, right? If you're Muslim, then it's if you're Muslim, then wee, and then if you're anything else, it's burn. So, well, actually, specifically with Islam thinks that when you die, your soul separates from your body. If you've been good, your soul just goes to sleep until it's reunited with your resurrected body. If you've been bad, you get judged, angels torture you, and then you get reunited with your body for another judgment, and you get more torture. But again, it'd be different for different people. It's not, it's all the same. And so what this order seems to suggest, that it's the same in everyone, right, is that something's happening in your brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
When the human brain starts being deprived of oxygen, when it starts to die, certain things happen in certain orders, right? And the kind of longer you're out, the deeper in that, hierarchy of things that happen, the deeper you get into that, and so the deeper your experience goes. And then if you get reactivated, right, if you get revived, you come out of that and you can actually, contain a memory of it. But that's what's going on. And it turns out that everything that is in near-death experiences, we basically understand the part of the brain that would become active or inactive as it's dying, that would produce that kind of experience, right? I have this in my the PowerPoint I sent you. Let me bring that up.
Yes.
Because I can.
One of the things that I found very interesting in one of the, I think the PowerPoint that you sent was the study that they did. I want to say was it on rats?
On rats, yeah.
Because I found that very fascinating. Tell us about that study.
Yeah, so let me finish my thought there, and I'll tell you about that.
Oh, sure.
So,
okay, absolutely.
So that like the sense of peace and well-being that's produced can be produced by dopamine and opioids that are released whenever the brain is under stress as it's shutting down, right? That feeling of separation from the body, stimulation of the temporal junction can actually cause that floating sensation. If you've ever had a dream where you felt like you were floating outside of your body, that's what was going on, right? The life review can be stimulation of the amygdala or the hippocampus where the memories are stored. That's being stimulated. That can cause those memories, right? The entering the darkness, or entering the darkness and seeing the light and all that kind of stuff. That tunnel vision, as the visual centers lose oxygen in the back, they can start to shut down, and you start to get that tunnel vision. In fact, you've probably had that tunnel vision before. If you've stood up too fast and got lightheaded or that kind of stuff, you get that kind of tunnel. Like that's the kind of thing that can happen in a more intense way when your brain is shutting down, right? And so the study you're talking about is that, and there's another one I also reference that's happened even since then, that there was this study done on rats where they, hooked them up to little brain monitors. Basically, I'm being oversimplistic, but they hooked them up to little brain monitors, and they asphyxiated them, they killed them, right? And they looked at what was going on inside their brain, and it turned out that long after their heart stopped, their brain was still exhibiting function that was completely consistent with, mouse versions of conscious experience that were correlated with the kinds of things that we usually see in near-death experiences. In other words, they were probably experiencing, right, a sense of well-being, right? There was this opioids that, that were being released, right? They very well likely have been, were seeing memories. They probably had a floating sensation, right? They certainly saw tunnel vision and that kind of stuff as their visual centers shut down. Complete, like the activity in their brain that's completely consistent with those kinds of conscious awarenesses while they were being dead. And another study I mentioned in one of the lectures I sent you that I'm working now, I'm revising my course for the great courses on metaphysics. I talk about a study that was done in 2013. I shouldn't say a study, I don't think. There was a human who happened to die while they were getting an EEG. And so they were actually able to directly observe what was going on in this person's brain. as they died. And it turns out that what was happening was exactly what you would expect happening, right? All the things that we think are going on inside the brain to produce these kinds of near-death experiences. That's what was going on inside their brain. It was completely consistent with him, with that patient having a conscious awareness and having conscious experience. That matches what a near-death experience is like for people. And so again, this is why it's kind of this fun science, pseudoscience thing, right? Near-death experiences are totally real. They exist. They happen, right? The question is, what causes them? Is it the soul floating away, or is it what happens in, is it your brain that's causing them, basically? And it's clearly the case that it's their brain that's causing them, right? Now, in response to that, some people will mention stories. There's Colton Burpo. There's, what was that guy's name? There was the appropriately named Alex Malarkey. There was, what was her name? Pam Reynolds, right? Yeah. There were these kind of famous cases where people supposedly were aware of things while they were dead, of what was going on in the room while they were dead. And so it must be that the soul was floating around to see those things. It turns out that all of these stories are bunk in one way or another, right? The Alex Malarkey case, he admitted later that he just made it up, like literally admitted it, and had to take all the books off the shelves, right? So the Alex Malarkey case is literally malarkey. Colton Burpo, I have a whole article on Colton Burpo. If you just Google my name and Colton Burpo, it'll come up. But like, he was never dead, so it doesn't count as a near-death experience at all. He was just like, his appendix exploded and they were afraid that he might die, but he never like flatlined or anything like that. And his is a classic case of like, the story keeps getting bolder and bigger over time. So clearly there's memory confabulation and all kinds of psychological stuff that's going on there. The big piece of evidence that's supposed to prove that he really visited heaven is in one of the later iterations of his story. He says that Jesus introduced him to his sister that he never had, and it was supposed to be a miscarriage. And it's like, well, we never told him about the miscarriage. How could he know unless Jesus told him? If you actually read the book, the parents who wrote the book admit that they told his older sister about the miscarriage. They never told him, but siblings talk, right? So I mean, so it's like, that's the big, like, oh my God, how could he have possibly known? His sister told him that's how he possibly knew, right? I mean, it's kind of silly. Some of the other cases were like, oh, they knew what was going on in the room while they were dead. It turns out they didn't. They probably had like anesthetic awareness or whatever. Like the experience they had was when their brain was still functioning. There's no way to know what, was when they were actually having the experience. Was it while their brain was still functioning or while it was, while it was out? Very often there's the case reports where people say, oh, they knew what was going on in the room while they were flatlined or whatever. Well, they think they knew what was going on in the room because they sent someone who was in the room at the time, like a nurse or something like that, in to ask the patient questions about what was going on in the room. And anybody who knows anything about like interrogation, and if you're actually wanting to know what people actually know, you don't send someone in who knows the right answers to the questions, right? And so clearly they're going in there asking them leading questions about, well, did you hear this? Oh, I did hear that. Ooh, they knew what was happening. Like, it's all completely, contaminated questioning and that kind of stuff. Right. Other reports, there was a famous report where somebody said that they saw shoes on the like on a ledge outside the hospital. And the only way they could have seen those shoes is if their soul was floating outside the building. People investigated the story. You could see the shoes from inside the room. Like it's not like the story just gets confabulated over time. It's, it's not legitimate in that kind of way. Right. The only kind of like, in other words, all of those stories are stories, right? They're passed on through multiple people. They're confabulated. There's hardly any way to check them. And when you can check them, they don't check out. The only kind of like real, actual, controlled, verifiable experiment that anyone's ever done to figure out if people's soul leave their body whenever they're near death. There was this study done where basically in I think like 4 different hospitals, I'm not exactly sure, there was like a number like over 1,000 patients, maybe 2,000 patients that were involved. They set up these placards in these rooms where people would often die and be resuscitated, right? And they put these placards up and they put a message on them, but they didn't tell anyone, including the doctors, what that placard was, where it was, or what message it said. But it would be clearly visible to anyone who was floating above the room, right?
Mhm.
And then anytime anyone had a near-death experience in that room, they would always go ask them, what did you see, right? And I don't even know if they asked them specifically, did you see a placard with the message or whatever? None of the patients, none of them, zero, reported being able to see the placard and what the message was, right?
Right.
And so, like, if that's what was really going on, if people's soul were floating outside their body and they were looking, one of them would have seen it, right? None saw it. So that's a really good reason for thinking that near-death experiences are not good evidence for the soul being real, right?
Right. So I have a couple questions from the live chat.
Sure.
One I just thought was kind of interesting. How are we supposed to be tortured in hell if we don't have a nervous system? How do souls feel pain?
Yes.
I thought that was a very good one.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it ultimately what they're pointing out here is that it doesn't make any sense, right? Like, since we know that pain is a result of the activity of a nervous system, if our nervous system is done, the soul doesn't have one, it shouldn't be able to feel pain, right?
Right.
I mean, I'm trying to remember. I'm pulling this out of a hat here, but there's a quote from somebody. I think it might be. I don't know who it is. But like, there's this problem. Like, if you don't have a body, right? Like, no. This is a similar. I'm sorry. This is a little bit different, but this is the kind of answer you'd get. There's this one problem of, like, if you are in hell and you're being burned, right? Burning consumes things. Eventually your body would be completely done and there'd be nothing left to burn. So how can you burn eternally, right? Because burning consumes things, right? And the answer is just kind of like, God somehow magically makes it the case that you burn but are never consumed, right? And so that's, I mean, the only kind of answer you can give to this kind of question is just like, oh, well, how does the soul feel pain? It just does, right? Like, it's
magic.
Makes it the case that because you need to feel punishment, and so it makes it the case that the soul can feel pain. But the questioner is right to point out it doesn't actually make sense, given that we know that a nervous system is necessary to feel pain. But once your nervous system is done, then you can't feel pain anymore.
I always wondered if you would have the same body that you have when you die, because a lot of people who die don't want to carry on with that body anymore because it's 98 years old, say, and hasn't walked in several years. But anyway, we have another one. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So Wes asked, can science disprove NDEs? And I put this one on because you had said that NDEs are real as far as the person experiencing it.
Right.
So how do you respond to this one?
So there's a couple, good question, Wes. So there's a couple different angles on this, right? So first of all, let me say this first. Science, because is an inductive method of reasoning, does not prove or disprove anything 100%, right? We often talk in those kinds of things. Science has proved and disproved it. I think that's why I use the term debunked the soul rather than disprove the soul, because science doesn't deal in proof and disproof, right? That's deductive logic, like if P then Q, P therefore Q. That's mathematics. That's that kind of stuff, where you can do logical proofs and geometric proofs and that kind of stuff. Science is all inference to the best explanation, and so it can prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. It can prove that something is irrational to believe, right? It can prove that something has more evidence than anything else, right? But it doesn't deal in 100% proof and disproof. That's just not the kind of reasoning that it is, right? So the short answer would be like, any question that says, can science disprove X? Science doesn't deal in proof, so no. But that doesn't mean that, like, thinking that the fact that you can't prove something false is a reason to think it's true is a logical fallacy called appeal to ignorance, right? So the fact that science can't do that is not a reason to believe anything, right? So, and part of the reason is, like, the reason that science can never prove anything 100% is because the future is always not 100% knowable. So who knows what kind of evidence might come down the line. The reason that science can never disprove anything is because the possibility of ad hoc excuses. Basically, anybody can make any kind of excuse for anything to save your theory from the evidence, because all theory and all evidence and all experiments are based on some kind of background assumption. So if your theory doesn't get the right prediction, you can always save it by changing the background assumptions. I could go on and on about that. So, but on the flip side, like, what science if near-death experiences did not exist at all, science could prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, right? Like, so we could, like, in the same way that like ESP, if ESP were real, we could, science could be used to give us good reasons to believe that ESP is real. Like, if it really did exist, we could do scientific studies to show that people have that kind of power. Like, that could happen. And people tried to do that, and it failed. Like, the experiments failed, right? And so as a result, that gives us good reason to think that ESP is not real. So it's beyond, science has shown beyond a reasonable doubt that ESP does not exist. So in the same way, if near-death experiences were not real, science could show beyond a reasonable doubt that they weren't, right? They are real, right? Science has actually done the opposite. It's shown that near-death experiences do occur. People have experiences near death, right? But science has also proved beyond a reasonable doubt that what's causing them is what's going on here. It's not floating away from your body, right? And so, again, it's not deductive proof, but it's beyond a reasonable doubt, right? It's the same level of evidence that we have for plate tectonics and the theory of gravity and the idea that the world is round, and like it's the same level of evidence for all of these things, right? Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. So we have a little more than 10 minutes, almost a little less than 15 minutes.
So let's.
I would.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I want to hear what you were going to say. Please do.
I was going to say, if we want to talk about whether, so the soul floating away from the body is only one way that afterlife might be possible. The way that people who reject the soul think it is possible is resurrection. So we could talk about that. And your question a while ago about like, well, if your body's 99 years old, why do you still
right?
So we can talk about that if you'd like.
Absolutely, I would love that because I mean I have a whole lot of questions about that. So yeah, go ahead. Let's get started.
So again, like this was one of the early Christian views that the way the afterlife is facilitated is by the resurrection of the body. Like in the same way that this is Paul again, right? Same way that Jesus was raised, we will be raised, and that's how we live on to the afterlife. Okay. There are a number of problems with this. All right. First of all, not only just like, how could it happen? I mean, you literally just have to say, well, God waves a magic wand and makes it happen. Okay, fine. Well, if God's real, he can do that. Let's say that, okay? Second problem, however, is that it would seem to be quite difficult, if not logically impossible, to resurrect someone once their body has completely decayed and gone into dust, right? Resurrecting someone who's only been dead for a day and a half, like Jesus, sure. Right? Like you could do that. You could repair the body by some kind of magical thing. And when you do, that would still be the same person, right? That'd still be the same subject of experience that died would be the same subject of experience that wakes up if they're only dead for 3 days or something like that, right? But if somebody's been dead for 1,000 years and all their bones are turned to dust and that dust has flown all over the world or whatever, right? Like, how are you going to resurrect them? There's no body left to resurrect, right? Now, you might say, well, God's God, just waving a magic wand here, right? To resurrect that person, what God could do is, I mean, he's all knowing, right? He could know where every atom in your body that was dead was, right? Where it ended up at, that he could just gather all those atoms and put you back together like a Lego figure, right? Like he could just and reform your body, and it would be the same body that you had when you were dead, right? And by the way, right, if you were 99 when you were dead or something like that, right, he could reform your body and then heal it, right? Like he could start a de-aging process or something like that, right? Or if you died from a sword to the head, he could heal that wound just like a doctor, and then it would heal, and then you would continue to live on, right? So we could solve that problem of, well, what if I don't like the body I have when I die? He could reconfigure that body, and then he could heal it over time. So again, we're waving a magic wand here. That's at least a logical possibility, right? However, again, we're stuck with this problem of, well, how do we, resurrect people who are gone 1,000 years? Maybe God gathers all the atoms up and puts them all together. Okay, there's two problems with that suggestion. One is, if that's what he's doing, then it is logically impossible for God to resurrect everyone. Why? Because we're all made of the same inorganic matter, right? Atoms that are in my body right now were in Julius Caesar's corpse, right? And Abraham Lincoln's corpse, and everybody, like we're all made of the same organic matter that is here on Earth, right? And so when I die, right, my matter will re-enter the ecosystem. Maybe a tree gets planted there, an apple tree. Somebody bites the apple off the apple tree. Now they've got some of my matter in them. And if they die, well, they've got my parts, right? You can't resurrect both of us. The analogy I use for my students is like, if you, oh, here's a good one. We just went and saw the Back to the Future musical on Broadway, right?
Uh-huh.
And then we went to the Lego store and we got the DeLorean Lego kit, right? The DeLorean Lego kit, you can build all three of the cars. There's three different versions of the DeLorean, one from from the first movie, one from the second, and one from the third, right? It's got all the parts for building all three of them, but you can only build one at a time, right? There's only like the base DeLorean parts for one of them, and you can accessorize with the the things from the different movies or whatever, right? You can't build all three DeLoreans at once because there's only one windshield, right? Is that making sense?
Yes, it does.
We're all made of the same matter. You can't resurrect us all. We all share the same matter. We're all made of the same pieces. And so you can't put everybody's bodies back together. Right? So that's one problem. All right. Now, to get out of that, we can wave another magic wand and say, okay, so maybe when you die, God magically makes it the case that whatever atoms made up your corpse, they never end up in another person's corpse. Like he just waves his magic wand. He just makes sure that doesn't happen so that we don't. I don't even know if there's enough matter for that to happen, given the number of humans on the planet. Let's say there is. Okay. Second problem. And this is a problem pointed out by no less than Christian philosopher Peter Van Inwagen. So this is not some atheist railing against Christianity. This is Notre Dame renowned Christian philosopher Peter Van Inwagen.
Okay.
He argues that even if God does that, even if God takes all the material that was in your corpse and puts all the atoms back together and then reanimates it, it's not you. It's not the same person. It's a different person. All right. And here's why. The example that he uses is, he says, suppose that a monastery has a manuscript penned by Aristotle. So it's an Aristotelian manuscript. And then the monastery burns down in a fire, including the manuscript. And then years later, the monastery rebuilds and they claim to have the same manuscript that was burned in the fire. And you say, oh, that can't be. The manuscript burned. And they say, no, God magically brought all the atoms that made up the manuscript and put them back in the same configuration. And therefore, it's the same manuscript. Peter Van Inwagen says, no, it's not. Even if God did that, it'd be a type identical manuscript. It'd look the same and it'd be made of the same material. But it's not the same thing. Why? Because an Augustinian manuscript is penned by Augustine. That manuscript is penned by God. It is a different object, right? The example I use Lego again. Lego is very useful for this kind of thing. My son and I spent 9 months putting together a Millennium Falcon, like a big Lego Millennium Falcon. It's in my basement right now, right? And we built it together. We really did build it together. It took us 9 months. That's the Millennium Falcon that we built, right? If one day I'm moving it and I drop it, and then I secretly put all the pieces back together myself, so it's obliterated, and I put all the pieces back together and I put it back on the shelf. And then Johnny brings his friend Joey over and he wants to show him the Millennium Falcon that we built. He can't, right? Same material, same configuration. It's not the same object. The causal explanation for how the pieces were placed are integral to the identity of that object. Once that causal story of how they got configured is broken, not even God can make that thing exist again. He can make something similar exist again, but he can't make one and the same object exist again. Let me give you one more. There's a Buddhist philosopher. I'm pulling this off the last episode of a great show called The Good Place. And I forget what the philosopher's name is. I can look it up. But this Buddhist idea of what a person is like our bodies are not made of the same material over our entire life, right? Like our cells, matter and stuff are replaced, right?
Right.
About a person being a wave, like a wave in the ocean, right? A wave is not made of the same material, right? It's a movement through the material of the ocean. This part of the ocean raises and then this part raises, and that's what a wave is, right? And when the wave is done, right, it crashes on the shore and all that material just goes right back into the ocean. So everything that made that wave is still there. It's just in a different form. Right. And that's the way they see death, right? That this particular Buddhist philosopher sees death is that We are just waves, and when we're done, the wave crashes and our material returns to the universe, and what made us is there is still there, but we're just returning back to the medium in which we existed, but we are no longer, right? Notice that when you understand a person that way, we understand waves in that kind of way, right? That wave cannot exist again.
Right.
Right? We could raise the same, the same water that was raised before and then raise this and create a type identical wave that looks exactly the same, but that will not be the same wave. That will be a different wave. That's what Peter Van Wagen is pointing at here, right? That even if God reassembled your matter in that kind of way, that wouldn't be you. That would be a different person, a different subject of experience, a different object, right? So even if we try to hang and say, oh, soul's not real, that's not how afterlife happens. Resurrection is how afterlife happens. At best, who can be raised are people who died in the last, I don't know, 25 years, right? Like maybe even that's stretching it, right? But this idea that everyone will be raised, it's not feasible. It's not logically feasible, even for God. And again,
that's such a good point. It made me think about the question that you have. If you slowly replace the parts of a ship, is it still the same ship? And it's really not. All the pieces have been changed.
Right.
It looks exactly the same, but it's not. And that's really the same thing with our bodies, because as you pointed out, we're not the same molecules or skin cells or whatever that we were when we were born. I mean, we don't look anything like that.
And we're made of different material.
We're made of completely different material. So if you were to die, and which of those atoms would it be? The ones that you sloughed off when you were 10 versus the ones that you sloughed off when you died? I mean, how in the world does that work?
So there's a philosopher named Peter Van Wagen who argues that as long as that cell by cell or atom by atom change happens what he calls gradually enough, and basically what he means is not even by time, but just like as long as it happens kind of one piece at a time, one atom at a time, or something like that, as long as it happens in that gradual manner, he says that numerical identity is preserved. So you don't have the same body that you did when you were 8 years old, but you are the same person you are now when you're 8 years old, because there's this physical continuity that stretches between you now and your 8-year-old self, because that process was gradual enough, right? Fair enough. Like, I mean, there could be objections to that, but fair enough. The problem is that resurrection doesn't do that, right? Especially if we're talking about throwing all the atoms that made your body back in together. That's not gradual, right?
Right.
Or like the Apostle Paul thinks that in the wink of an eye will be changed from a physical body to a spiritual body. Even if you're doing that one atom at a time, if that happens in 300 milliseconds, which is the blink of an eye, that's not gradual, right? That's a different person, right? If you're changing all of my matter that quickly. And so it's just not feasible, and it doesn't look like, well, let me put it this way, how ridiculous. So again, this is Christian philosopher Peter Van Wagen. Van Wagen says that given what we've learned about what is necessary for preserving identity, so you can't break that causal chain, that causal story for how your body is configured the way it is. He says the only way an afterlife is possible is if God's a body snatcher, is if right before you die, God swoops in and takes your body out and heals it and puts it in the afterlife, so that physical continuity is not broken. And you say, well, but obviously that doesn't happen. We bury a body, right? And Van Wagen says, well, then if you believe in the afterlife, what you have to believe is that God takes that living body out and swaps in a dead replica, and that's what you bury. So in order for again, Christian philosopher Peter Van Wagen says the only way an afterlife is possible is if God's a body snatcher, right? Now, to be fair, Van Wagen later republishes that paper with a little addendum at the end, and he says, maybe there's some other way I can't think of, right? Anytime I read that little addendum to the end of his paper, I almost always see there's somebody at Notre Dame hovering over him saying, you need to say that you were wrong, right? And so he's like, well, maybe there's a way that I can't, right? But I can imagine there was.
Keep that door open.
But anyway, so that's unfortunately, I'll end with this. This might be bad news for people, right? If there's no afterlife, then is there any meaning to life, and blah, 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 blah. We all make up our own meaning, whether we're making it up with God or whatever,
Absolutely.
Right? It has nothing to do with the meaning of life. Let me put it this way. Not believing in an afterlife adds meaning to your life, because if you think there's an afterlife, you are very likely to waste this life trying to earn points for that thing that doesn't exist.
Exactly.
Realizing that you are going to die adds a kind of urgency to your life to make sure that you make the best of the limited life that you have. If you think there's an afterlife out there, you could end up wasting a whole bunch of it.
Oh, that is the perfect way to end the show. I completely agree. And the Southern in me wants to say amen. Because people say amen around here, even if you don't believe in God. Uh, so thank you so much. If you guys liked what we just talked about, there are many ways that you can help us. One is hitting the like, subscribe, and share. All of those are great, but consider being a patron. I want to thank the current patrons that we have: Puck, Helen, Greene, Logan Fisher, Amanda McLeod, Eric Ozols, Rion, Deneen Murphy, Dan D, Michael Wiseman, me, Aaron Colson, and Phil Calderone. Thank you guys. You guys help us keep the lights on. Also, I want you to know that we're looking for volunteers for producing, booking, and call screening. So if you're interested, please contact us at wesdsturtevant@gmail.com, and Wes will get you hooked up really, really quickly. Other than that, keep in mind we also have other shows that we want you to see. We have Tuesdays, Secular Soapbox. Of course, Thursdays are here with me with Sunny on the Sunny Spot. We have Saturdays, the Global Atheist and Women Atheist Unload. And then on Sunday, we have Let's Talk, where you can call in and talk to us and ask us questions. We love talking to fellow atheists, but we will take calls from just about anyone. In the meantime, please look up Kyle's information. I know that Wes had put a couple things in the chat, and they're also in the show notes. So please take a look at Kyle. Thank you so much, Kyle, for coming on and talking to us. It was such a great conversation. I love the way that you present things. You make it very easy for us all to understand, and I appreciate
that. Thanks. I like to hear that. That's what I try to do. Thank you, Sonny. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And remember, everyone, always think critically. Good night.
Part of our being knows this is where we came from. We long to return. And we can, because the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political or religious, who comes ambling along.